So I'm delighted to have this opportunity to welcome you to this event, and I'm doing so on behalf of the Institute of New Economic Thinking, of our institute at the LSE, and CEDA, you already had a welcome from, and the International Economic Association. We are very excited to have this day here in Mexico, and we are very grateful to the speakers who have come. It's very high-level speakers, and we are also very grateful for the audience that we have of a very important policymakers and business people from Mexico. So I think we have all the ingredients that we need to have an interesting discussion. So the Institute of New Economic Thinking was created in the very beginning of the global financial crisis in an effort to better understand the causes of the crisis and to come up with solutions. And it was a feeling that economics had kind of disappointed the world, and it has not been very good at predicting what happened, and it had not, of course, been effective enough to prevent it from happening. And it was a sense when the Institute of New Economic Thinking was created that there was a need for new economic thinking, new research, and new policy ideas. And there was also a thinking, and this is, I think, critical, that a lot of these ideas would have to come from the emerging world, from the very particular challenges that the emerging world is facing. And that's very much the spirit of this conference. And it's also the spirit in which the Institute of Global Affairs at the LSE was created, very much to engage with emerging economies on the global issues, and doing so on the basis of high-quality research. And this event is very much a symbol of what we want to achieve, mobilizing global brainpower to address these key challenges for emerging economies. So while these challenges are global, they also have a very important local context. And this is where the decision has to, or the exact nature of these challenges manifest themselves. And this is where the policy decisions that will be trying to address these challenges take place. And you heard from this morning, those of you who attended the opening of the IEA, that Mexico is from so many perspectives a very interesting lens through which to look at the world. And it's like so many emerging economies, you had to live with the ramifications of a global financial crisis to which you didn't contribute very much, and also the uncertainty that has been created around the whole international framework, the framework for collaboration in so many areas, and that's something that surely will come up during the day. And Minister Mead said earlier today that Mexico is interesting because it's also so open and so connected to so many different parts of the world, and that's why Mexico is so interesting. I also must admit I have a personal bias Mexico. My wife was born in Cuernavaca, and she in part grew up here, and our daughters, when I'm here, I'm finding out more and more about why my daughters are the way they are, and it's, I mean it in a very positive sense. So the organizers of this event very much hope that this will only be the beginning of our engagement in Mexico. Many of the issues that INET want to address are also front and center on the policy agenda in Mexico. And we will later today launch the Global Transformation Commission led by Mike Spence and Joe Stiglitz. And this is very much, again, an attempt to try to think about the global transformation, but also look at it from the perspective of emerging economies. And for the LSE, Mexico also has a particular interest. We have a very active and very prominent alumni in Mexico, and we have just created a Center for Latin America and the Caribbean, and Gareth Jones, the director, is here. And we think everything we've seen from CEDA so far has been very encouraging. We think this is a very promising local partner for us to think about future activities, and Fausto Hernandez is here, and we very much appreciate his contribution to making this event happen. Finally, I want to thank Zimat, who has been so important in creating this event, and my own team from IDA at the LSE. All of them have been critical to make this event come through. Many of you attended the opening lecture of Joe Stiglitz. Joe Stiglitz will join us at the end of the day, and we'll have a chance to follow up maybe on some of the issues that he raised. I wanted to just now take the opportunity also to introduce Juan Ernesto Pardinas. You don't need him an introduction. The Mexican audience doesn't need an introduction of him. He's the Secretary General, or Director General of the Institute for Competitiveness in Mexico. He is a very well-known public figure in the country, and we have a special relationship because he is an alumnus of LSE and has a PhD from LSE, and we very much grateful that you will take on yourself to moderate the two first panels. So please, Juan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Eric. I was supposed to start this panel saying good morning. Given the pass of time, I should say good afternoon to everybody. We should mind the time. I thank you to CEDE and the London School of Economics for the opportunity to rekindle my relation with my alma mater, and also the privilege to moderate this panel. Once my father told me that I should work very hard to have a CV with where a single line was enough to tell who I was. I still have like a 5-page, and I have to work hard as other members of the panel that with a single line I could describe the role. We have Alicia Bárcena, Secretaria de la CEPAL, Mario Beljar, he was former governor of the Central Bank of Argentina, Ann Kruger, Chief Economist of the World Bank, Guillermo Ortiz, gobernador del Banco de México y exsecretario de Hacienda, y Andrés Velasco, exsecretario de Hacienda y, ¿puedo decir la candidatura? Próximo candidato al Senado de Chile, a quien le deseamos los mejores, the most auspicious signs in your political career. I would ask to mind time to use between 5 and 7 minutes for your introductory remarks, and then we move to have more like a dialogue with the moderator and the members of the audience. Alicia, if you could use this 7 minutes. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I was asked to speak about something that I would like very much to highlight, and maybe later on we can have an open discussion. I'm going to talk about the tensions and opportunities of globalization. So first of all, let me tell you what I think is happening. Oh, thank you. What I think is happening today, at least here, nothing. Okay, yes, mejor. Gracias. ¿Se oye bien? ¿Sí? Okay. What I think is happening today is that we are under long-term mega trends. First of all, we have geopolitical changes. There is a very new role of China. Everybody knows this. They were in the Belt and Road just a month ago. So they are really willing to play a totally new role in international economy, military, and I would say in multilateralism in general. The US, of course, and Europe. So the three, let's say, are rebalancing their power, let's put it that way. Secondly, the fourth industrial revolution, which I think is going to have this convergence between robotics, ICT, biotechnology, genetics, neurology, nanotechnology. All of this is going to impinge, of course, in the way we do things, in the way we produce and consume, and of course, is going to change the future of work. Is going to be completely different. Then we have climate change, which is a global problem, whether the US doesn't recognize it today, but it is there. And then, of course, the growing inequality, as Stiglitz told us. And finally, the demographic transition and migration, which I think it's very relevant. Now, let me quickly tell you what I think are the tensions of globalization, and of course, what are the repercussions. Number one, I think there is a very low dynamism of the global economy. High unemployment, wage stagnation, especially in developed countries, growing migratory flows, increasing inequality, and of course, as I said, there's an intense competition from Asian manufacturers. Now, the repercussions is that we have the rise of economic nationalism. I think we are living through that. Then, of course, the opposition towards trade agreements, resistance to immigration, and the middle class perception of losers that we have there, and of course, the greater exposure to financial volatility. Of course, one of the major problems we have is that GDP and trade, for the first time ever, are closer. And this never happened before since the 80s. So now we have a trade deceleration that is really very worrisome. And of course, we have the winners and the losers of the globalization period. In B, we will find the developed countries' middle class that have non-grown. There is a wage stagnation. They feel they are the losers. We have A, which are the middle class. This is the elephant curve that was presented by the IMF. And of course, we have the A, which are the middle class that are emerging, the China middle class, let's say, and C, the world riches, which is getting more and more, let's say, more richer every time. The declining trend of the share of labor income. I think this was also mentioned by Stiglitz, which is a very important thing. But what I believe is the problem in developing countries, in many countries, is the prisoner's dilemma, which is that nobody, I mean, in relation to the world of work and social policy, the countries are unwilling to unilaterally increase social protection of workers because of the bargaining power and so forth, and they believe this is going to make them lose in terms of domestic and external markets. And of course, probably the most difficult thing that we are living towards today is the inequality factor, in which we find that, as accordingly to Forbes and accordingly to the Credit Suisse, today, 8 individuals are holding the wealth of half of the population of the world, of 3.5 billion people. So that's the problem. And of these 8, 6 of them are linked to digital and technology assets. Migration. Migration is a huge problem today for 2 reasons. For low growth in countries like Central America and Mexico going to the US, but the other one that is more relevant is the one that comes from conflicts. It has increased 11% in Europe, coming from Africa and from the Middle East, basically. Then, of course, what we have seen in CEPAL is that the cross-border flows, I mean the financial flows, are decreasing in many fronts, but except the digital flows. The digital flows are the only ones that are growing and growing and growing, but not the financial flows. And also the problem we see is this transition that we are going into from hyper-globalization. We are in a moment of hyper-globalization that is a vision that prevailed in the 90s when trade and financial liberalization, market deregulation, without safeguarding the global public goods. And we believe that we have to move into a new economy. I mean, I'm very much in favor of what Stiglitz said at the end, in which we really need a new proposition in international cooperation to regulate markets, to administer the tensions, to reduce inequalities, and to have an open international system that really safeguards international goods. And we at ECLAC, we are pushing very much towards what we call the technological revolution and to move into a new environmental big push. That is that the push that the economy should have should come from technology, yes, but also going to a digital market, no question, but to move to low carbon energy patterns, to the circular economy, to smart cities, to the care economy, and to build endogenous capacities by making sure that we are able to absorb creating the technologies. This is where I will stop Thank you very much. Ay, te devuelvo el micrófono.
Thank you very much, Alicia, for your presentation and your superb management of time. Now, following the alphabetical order, I give the word to Mario Blecher. Thank you, Mario.
Muy buenas tardes a todos. Agradecer.
Tiene micrófono.
Creo que el micrófono no funciona.
I don't know how Alicia managed to have notes, a marker, the computer, and the microphone. No, quería agradecer a nuestros hermanos mexicanos la hospitalidad y voy a pasar al inglés porque si no van a descubrir que lo que yo hablo no es un invento argentino, no español precisamente. I will concentrate on the same issue that Alicia talked, but just on the monetary side. The issue of globalization in the monetary side and the current situation on this area. You may remember that when the Berlin Wall fell, there was this famous book, The End of History. The idea was that basically communism is gone, and the major problems or dilemmas of economic management and social organization has been resolved. Obviously, that was a complete failure, the idea. But in the monetary area, we had something similar. We thought that after a great moderation before the 2008 crisis, we thought that we know everything. We know what are the relationship between monetary policy and inflation and other important variables. We thought that we know how to do that we knew how the model is, what the system is, and also we knew how the institutions should be, what is the nature of the institutions. Today, after the crisis of 2008, and what Eric said at the beginning, that economics may have failed in some way, or there's a feeling that it failed, we basically have a complete different situation. I think that we have moved from a situation of total certainty about monetary policy and monetary issues to a situation of a large and big uncertainty. We really don't know very well what's happening, and even worse, we don't know at all what will happen. What we know, however, is that there are differences across countries, that that one model fits all is not really what we can predict or we can use, and that there are real differences between emerging and advanced countries in the instrumentation of monetary policy, in the impact of monetary policy, and particularly on the institutional framework for monetary policy. We have moved from a situation in which there was a transfer of knowledge and a transfer of practice from advanced countries into emerging markets. I personally was involved practically all my professional life in this type of exercise. My first job was here in Mexico, actually, in the so-called Center for Monetary Studies in Latin America. And we did have right there a kind of idea that we have to translate what is being done in advanced countries for the use of emerging markets. And this continued many years with the international organizations, the World Bank and the IMF, all what is called technical assistance. It's a transfer of knowledge. And this transfer was supposed to be transfer of the good practices and some transfer of knowledge that will prevent, or that will assure that the positive effects of monetary policy are globalized. The same continues in many other areas. But today I think we are in a very different situation. There are very many, particularly because new type of trade-offs appear. In fact, the trade-offs that we knew between two variables are converted today into what is called the trilemmas, which are very kind of, choices that we have to take between three variables. And in this area, the trade-off between prices and activity has been converted into a trilemma in which we add financial stability to. So we have three variables or three objectives. that we need to reach. Now, let me, for the sake of time, just not mention what I think is today the questions that in emerging markets will appear or are appearing as a consequence of doubts that are being raised by the management of monetary policy. Particularly, the question that arises in emerging markets is what would happen if emerging markets would engage in something similar to quantitative easing.
To what?
To quantitative easing. What will happen if we do increase money supply or basically monetary assets in the same amount, in the same proportion, at the same rate as in advanced countries? Probably we will have an inflationary sort of explosion. But so what are the components of what was the wisdom? And today there are doubts. I think there are doubts about each one of these components. First, the issue of inflation targeting. The sole target of a central bank being inflation, and what Joe Stiglitz mentioned, like the overemphasis of inflation as an objective. He points out that increased inequality because it increased the price of assets, and the price of assets are concentrated and so on. But there are other negative effects of what was thought that this is the framework, inflation targeting. I am not claiming here it is not the framework. I'm claiming that it's open for revision. Also, the issue of central bank independence that was taken as as something that is metaphysical almost, cannot be argued. And today there are questions how much it helped during the crisis, and how much it has to be maintained. Or the location of bank supervision. It should be with the central bank, it should be an independent agency. This is being discussed. The treatment of government debt when it is interagency debt. Do you believe, however, you believe that the Treasury in America may implement an austerity program in order to pay the Fed? I don't think that is a very likely situation. It's a question, right? And finally, probably the most interesting or most important question from the point of view of possible research is what is the complete framework for the transition mechanism of monetary policy. And there are differences between advanced and emerging markets. Maybe the transmission mechanism is quite different. And there are a number of questions for that. The bottom line here is that we have not seen the end of this picture, of this movie. We have not seen the end of this movie. And the end of the movie may be very different from what we are assuming at this particular juncture. It may be that it is resolved in a very organized and in a very friendly manner, but it may also be that it will create additional tensions, and if measures are not taken, are not recognized in advance, this could end up in a situation that will require complete new thinking of all the parameters that we are discussing. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. There's so much to talk about and so little time, so let me focus on a few key things. I think everybody in this room and everybody in this city and probably everybody in this country and in the world perhaps would agree that we are not living in the best of times. There are all kinds of problems, and the question is what to do. I want to start by saying that yes, things do not look good in a number of regards, but one advantage of having been around for a little while is that I've been in situations before where we heard what the problem was that was going to destroy the world. And in most of those cases, just about the time when we got some kind of research answers or some kinds of policy answers, what happened was that the situation changed. Let me give you a few examples. When I was in graduate school, the number one pressing problem in the international financial system was the dollar shortage. Too many countries didn't have enough dollars. They had balance of payments difficulties with the United States. And the dollar was the only measure there was. Well, by the time I was a little bit beyond that and beginning to teach international finance, guess what happened? Dollar glut. So that was one. Secondly, the oil price increase, which was going to reduce productivity growth forever. It was going to cut world growth. It was going to do all kinds of bad things. And it had some bad effects, no doubt. But on the other hand, within a few years, we discovered that perhaps the oil price wasn't quite as permanent as everybody thought it was. It went down. Then in the early part of the last decade, again, an oil price peak. That was going to last forever. The IMF even said so. Over $100 a barrel for sure was the minimum. And now, of course, we are worrying about it getting too low and what that will do to the international economy. Problems are there, and as we get along, sometimes they find solutions, even though at the time we think they're immutable. I could go on. The fall of the Berlin Wall was certainly not anticipated by very many people, or at least not in any way they spoke publicly, and there are many more. The second thing I want to say is a little bit different, but perhaps equally important, and that is a long time ago when I was at the University of Minnesota, there was an election for mayor in Minneapolis, and there was universal agreement among anybody who knew anything, I think, that one of the candidates for mayor would be a disaster. He would be really awful. As it happened, I was giving the election party that night when everybody came over, and lo and behold, this guy won. Whereupon the debate centered on, are we better or worse off? He will be such a disaster that everybody will learn and do better. And in that case, they turned out to be right. Doesn't mean they always will, but it does not mean that you are always stuck with the bad guy forever. Sometimes lessons are learned. That much said, let me turn to emerging markets and the international financial system. There are lots of things that need to be done, and I'll come back to that for 1 minute at the end. But the first thing I want to say is that the United States has taken a leadership position, sometimes with justified criticism of the way it's done it, but nonetheless, on the whole, supporting an open multilateral trading and financial system. And I think that has been good for most of the world, emerging markets, poor countries, rich countries, etc. And right now, that system certainly is not going to be strengthened greatly by at least the current United States administration, and there's certainly no hint of leadership there. The Chinese certainly have indicated they are not ready, and the Europeans, as we know, have problems of their own. So at the moment, it seems to me that the appropriate resolution or the appropriate solution for those of us who care about these things is to be giving as much fight, as much as we can, to showing the benefits of the system as it now is, showing what does need to be done, but recognizing that for the moment, I'm afraid the reaction or the action will be defensive, at least in the short run. To say that we could go ahead with major improvements at this time, we should have a new convention where we'll have new articles of the agreement of the IMF or something like that, I think is a formula for disaster. I do not think in the current environment that we would have come out with it with anything as good as we've got, although obviously there is need for improvement. There are all kinds of issues, of course, some of which have already been mentioned, but I guess I remain of the view that the competition among countries in economics and in their economic power matters, and it matters because more successful policies tend to be demonstrated over time, not in any 1 year, with sounder growth and more sustainable growth and what have you. And I think that will happen in the years that are coming. Even if things get worse because of things the Trump administration does or something, those countries that remain focused on getting their own economic houses in order and getting flexible economic frameworks, level playing fields for competition in the private sector, appropriate institutional frameworks, the usual mantra of things, will do better than those that don't. And as that example becomes obvious, more obvious once again, I think some of the steam that has gotten behind criticisms and desire to go back to more of the policies of the 1950s and 1960s will diminish simply because those who do not do it and who stay with on the course will do better. That's perhaps an optimistic view, but I happen to believe it. Competition among countries has been important historically. The fact that the Netherlands and the UK got way ahead of most of the continent of Europe moved the continent of Europe. The fact that the Soviet Union did so poorly in terms of its breakup, one significant factor was the economic behavior and comparison with countries that followed other systems. And I could go on. There are many linkages that way between countries, and I think that's going to be important and the way for emerging markets to react. Bringing in the shell, at least to me, goes in the wrong direction. That said, the international financial system does need more work. We recognized from the last financial crisis a lot of things that were needed and that have not been done. Shoring up the mechanisms for the banking connections between countries is clearly important, and there's more that can be done on that. The issue of sovereign debt and how to handle that has certainly not been resolved in a way that in the long term seems to be satisfactory. And the underlying factor in was global imbalances, and there is still nothing to stop the large countries from once again getting into that situation, and if they do, with the same kinds of buildups, or different ones, it's likely to be different, than before. So I do not think that we are by any means out of the woods. There is plenty to be done to strengthen the system, but at the moment, I think the challenge is holding it together and keeping to speak out and to defend the system against the challenge or the criticisms that it's terrible simply because it is not as good as it could be. The problem is it could be worse as well as could be better. And to make sure that it's not worse, I think, is the first order of business. The second order of business will be, once we've done that, to make it better. Support to prevent backsliding is, I think, horribly important. Everybody here knows that the Trump administration has said they're going to renegotiate NAFTA. And if anybody here knows what that means, it's more than I know. They haven't really given a clue. But I think evidence that can be presented in Mexico, in other countries, as to the benefits for Mexicans and for other parties to different preferential trading agreements and for the open system are important and will matter in the discussion that follows. I do not think the outcome will necessarily be ideal, but I do think that evidence-based contributions that show what the contributions have been to both countries will make a difference and will at least moderate the damage that could otherwise be done in the short run. So I'm sort of saying that yes, there's lots to be done to make things better in the long run. At the moment, I think, however, it's more important to make sure that we don't backslide relative to what we've got. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think I need the microphone. Okay, I'm going to start by picking up on some of Anne's points regarding the international financial system, the evolution of the international architecture, since the global crisis, and then talk a little bit about the relevance of this evolution for emerging markets, and maybe conclude with a reflection on the global trading system. So what's happened since the great crisis on the global financial architecture? If we understand by the global financial architecture the set of sort of international agreements that govern key aspects of the balance of payments, like international reserves, capital flows, international payments, and so on, the answer is very simple. Nothing has happened since then. And it's paradoxical because obviously the one thing that was brought very clearly by the global crisis, by the great crisis, is the huge interaction between countries and financial system. And a shock to a major country had terrible spillovers all over the world. And nonetheless, although there was an initial impulse at the G20 in 2008, 2009, to push for an agenda of reform of the international financial system and the international monetary system, there was really no progress in terms, again, of the global financial architecture. The last chance that we had to have a politically serious discussion was in 2011, when Sarkozy was the head of the G20 at the presidential level. He commissioned a study led by Tommaso Palascioppi and so on. It was actually a very good study, a very thorough study on the kinds of issues that Anne was talking about regarding the stability of capital flows, asymmetry of adjustment, and the use of SDRs, all these things. It was called the Palais Royal study. It never got discussed because obviously the meeting, the G20 meeting, was hijacked by the debt crisis. That was the end of the story. No more discussion. The other initiative that was pushed by the G20 actually gained some traction, which was the strengthening of the international financial system as defined by the interplay between institutions, regulators, shadow banking, and so on and so forth. In that respect, there's been considerable progress, both the Financial Stability Board was strengthened, as well as the role of regulatories like the ECB and so on and so forth. There we have achieved a considerable amount, I would say, of strengthening of buffers in major international financial institutions, capital, liquidity, central counterparties for derivative trading, a number of issues that real progress has been made. So we have a system today which is safer than we had the one we had before the crisis. But now the problem is that the current Trump administration is doing a whole revision, at least in the US, of the regulatory framework, which was encompassed in the Dodd-Frank Act, included things like the Volcker Rule and so on. So all that is under revision. And it's under revision in the light of the agenda pushed by the financial industry in the United States. So the industry is very happy, so we'll see what happens. Because the criticism that of the proposals abandoned by President Trump has been that this is not only weakening consumer protection, but also the appetite to increase in more risky behavior on the part of financial institutions, which is what led in the first place to the global financial crisis. So this is another discussion. So what's left? I mean, the problems are the same. Instability of capital inflows, sudden stops, for emerging markets. I'm coming to the emerging market part now. Just remember the taper tantrum. In May of 2013, Mr. Bernanke mentioned that he was about to start tapering the purchase of treasury bills and agencies. And then we had a huge shock in terms of equity, in terms of asset prices, in terms of capital flows for all emerging markets, which was pretty indiscriminately at first. Then it became more clear that countries with better fundamentals were able to fare this better. So what is the conclusion for emerging markets? Nothing has changed. Okay? So we have to do things on our own, and the recipes are pretty much the same. Given the state of disarray in the world monetary system and financial, which has persisted already for quite a bit of time, the fundamental things are, again, sound fiscal policy, the avoidance of imbalances that might, result in bubble prices in local financial systems and so on. As we saw recently, the accumulation, for example, of debt, given the extremely low interest rate environment of recent years in emerging market, particularly in the corporate sector, is a worrying thing. So these are the kinds of things that we have to be watching. Let me say a last word, if I have a minute, on the trading system. As you know, Mr. Trump has taken a mercantilist view of the world. Surpluses are good because they're a sign of national strength. Deficits are bad because they take away our jobs and they provoke unemployment. This obviously doesn't take into account the basic notion that deficits are just the difference between expenditures and income. Okay? Now, if you look at the US, and I'll finish with this example, the US has been running current account deficits more or less since the 80s, almost every year. And the US current investment position, that is, what the US owes the rest of the world, is about 43% of GDP. It's a staggering number. Yet, net income, on the income side, the net income that the US, that results from the interaction of the US with respect to the world is a positive 1% of GDP. So 43% debt and 1% positive income. So that is a great deal for the U.S. I mean, in terms of Mr. Trump dealing maker, you know, you can't get a better deal than that. Okay? Let me conclude here, because I was going to go on and talk a little bit about the implications for this trading system for the emerging market, but we can leave it for questions and answers. So.
Andres, I pass on the microphone, the only working microphone on the panel.
This one does work.
No.
¿Se escucha? No se escucha. ¿O sí se escucha? Sí. Muy buenas tardes, encantado de estar aquí. También me paso al inglés. I am very happy to talk about inequality, global warming, the future of work. Certainly we can have fun talking about Donald Trump. But let me begin by being a boring financial economist and say a little bit about the financial system. And then maybe in the Q&A period we can have fun and say bad things about Trump. Or at least his haircut. So this is my reading, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the same issues that several of my co-panelists dealt with here, but I want to take a squarely emerging market perspective. So I want to think about how does the world look like from Mexico City or Sao Paulo or Santiago or any of the equivalent countries, say in Eastern Europe or in East Asia. And in particular, I'm worried about one thing: the volatility of international capital flows and the implications that has for the domestic management of the economy, financial stability, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, this is not a new subject. We've been talking about this, ever since I can remember, probably going back to the Greeks. A few years ago, the state of play, intellectually speaking, was more or less like this. We had all read in our textbooks about something called the trilemma, the notion that you cannot have an independent monetary policy, free capital movements, and a fixed exchange rate at the same time. And countries that tried to do this, of course, got into a great deal of trouble. The debt crisis of the 80s and all those collapses. So the lesson was, okay, we can't do that. We give up on one thing. What do we give up on? We give up on exchange rate management. We have flexible exchange rates, and we carry on. Has that worked? Has it not? Is that conventional wisdom still applicable? I want to argue that maybe yes, maybe not. In one respect, yes. Inflation is much lower, say in Latin America, than it used to be. Of course, with the exception of Venezuela, where tremendous human suffering is taking place as a result of unbelievably misguided policies, but that's really a different cup of tea. But elsewhere in the region, even in Argentina, inflation is coming down, right? I was kidding with Mario, so we came in. This may be the first panel I've attended where we will not spend all of our time worrying about Argentina. Even in Argentina, inflation is, 25% by the end of this year or something like that. So yes, we have moved forward in that respect. However, it is not clear to me that simply having floating exchange rates, focusing monetary policy on domestic objectives is working as well as the conventional wisdom would have it. The conventional wisdom would tell you that let the exchange rate do all the work. You are free then to have your own interest rate. You use that interest rate to keep inflation low, to keep unemployment low. End of story. What's the problem? I think there are at least three problems. Some of these are well known, some of these are not so well known. Problem number one is that countries are not prepared to live with a kind of exchange rate volatility this arrangement would call for. And exhibit number one is Mexico. I think this country has a great central bank, very wise and able monetary authorities, but the fact is that Mexico tends to shadow the US interest rate with amazing regularity, which suggests to an observer like me that there are difficulties, exactly what they are I'm not sure, in following the standard model, targeting the interest rate only at domestic objectives and letting the exchange rate move in any way the market will take it. Problem number two is that there's increasing evidence that monetary conditions get transmitted to countries in Latin America or emerging markets almost independently of what exchange rate regime you have. There's a woman called Hélène Rey, who's a professor, not at LSE, but at the competition down the street at LBS, my apologies for this allusion, who has been writing lots of papers showing that really what drives the world financial cycle is what the Fed does. And as a result, you have booms in lending whenever interest rates in the US are low, regardless of whether you float, whether you don't float, whether your central bank is green, yellow, or blue. So the idea that by floating you insulate yourself is not completely clear. Issue number 3 is that if 2 is right, then you're going to get booms in lending, and as Guillermo was saying, potentially big issues with financial stability, right? Because if whenever US interest rates are very low, capital comes in, your banks recycle that money, there's a lending boom, then there may be a tension between exchange rate movements, capital flows, and financial stability. In fact, some people are saying that there's no such thing as a trilemma. That's rubbish. It's really a dilemma. If you want to have capital mobility, you may not be able to have domestic financial stability. Some people would tell you that's not true, that in fact there's something called macroprudential tools that will do all the heavy lifting. I'm not sure that's right. Yes, macroprudential tools are great. Can they in fact really attenuate these cycles, lending booms and lending busts? I suspect not. So what is to be done? I don't have, unlike Joe Stiglitz, I don't have a recipe to fix everything. But it seems to me that the alternatives are really twofold, or at least they fall under 2 broad categories. One is restrict capital mobility, and this clearly cannot be the first best, because it is nice to be able to borrow abroad when you need to. Category number 2 of solutions has to do with having international institutions that enable countries to mitigate the effects of these flows on domestic economies. And here, I think the record is pretty poor, because the IMF for the last 25 years has been trying to come up with facilities that will provide lending of last resort in dollars, mind you. Lending of last resort in pesos is no fun. You need lending of last resort in dollars. And every 5 years, the IMF has a new thing. It's called the CCL and the PPL, and the acronyms keep changing. They don't work very well for many reasons that would be too lengthy to discuss right now. And as a result, countries are still faced with a very ugly set of trade-offs. Countries try to float their exchange rate imperfectly. They try to control the domestic interest rate imperfectly. They try to ensure domestic financial stability imperfectly. And the trade-offs are ugly precisely because the international financial arrangements are so inadequate, are so lacking. What is the risk? And I will end here. I think the risk is we will do very little about this. We will do nothing. There are other commissions and committees. I currently sit on one commissioned by the G20, by the Germans, and we will deliver the results next year when Argentina gets to host the G20. I can tell you we're going to have brilliant ideas. I suspect we will not solve all the problems. And of course, the risk is we will carry on just as we're carrying today until the next crisis comes. And then, of course, it will be too late. Thank you very much.